Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Could the loss of one thing mark the start of most chronic diseases? Join us now as we investigate the recent findings on a colorless gas that possibly holds the key. Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. With us this hour to explore the latest on nitric oxide biochemistry and its impact on our health is Dr. Nathan S Bryan. Dr. Bryan, the author of Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing the Science to Life, earned his undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of Texas and his doctoral degree from Louisiana State University School of Medicine, where he was the recipient of the Dean's Award for Excellence in Research. He's been involved in nitric oxide research for the past 20 years. Dr. Bryan is an international leader in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry. His website, drnathansbryan.com. Dr. Bryan, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's just a pleasure. This is a very interesting topic. So, how did you first become interested? It seems kind of remote in nitric oxide.
After I was got a degree in biochemistry, I'd always had an interest in science and medicine, but I was a student at LSU School of Medicine in my first year. This was, I believe, the late 90s, 99 or 2000, and a Nobel Prize had just been awarded for the discovery of nitric oxide to 3 U.S. scientists. And I was very fortunate to have Dr. Ignaro, come to our school and lecture before the student body. And he talked about his journey of discovery and what led to the Nobel Prize. And, it was this molecule, nitric oxide, that we knew was an extremely important molecule, a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system, but there were still so many unanswered questions. And so really it was and he said to me that night at dinner, he goes, Nathan, if the scientific community can figure out how to restore the natural production of nitric oxide, it'll change the world and change the landscape of healthcare and how we treat patients. So, that was a profound statement that stayed with me, 30 years later, 25 years later.
Oh, goodness. So so we're all on the same page, what is nitric oxide?
Well, it's a naturally produced gas. We call it a signaling molecule, but it's naturally produced in the lining of the blood vessels. It's produced by our immune cells to kill off invading pathogens, from viruses to bacteria. It's produced in our neurons in the brain. It's part of signal transduction and as a neurotransmitter. But it's a signaling molecule, so its primary role is to dilate blood vessels and improve oxygen delivery, improve circulation. And so what we're finding is that the older we get, the less of this naturally produced molecule that the body makes, and that's what's responsible for many age-related diseases.
Well, if it's responsible for the oxygen level in the body, I can certainly see how brain function would start to deteriorate if it's not there, right? As you age.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, if you look at any chronic disease, whether it's dementia, Alzheimer's, or heart disease or kidney disease, lung disease, there's always kind of what we call 4 major hallmarks. There's always reduced blood supply to that organ. So for instance, in ischemic heart disease, the blood vessels are occluded, and there's not enough blood supply getting to the working myocardium to supply the heart muscle with the energy and the oxygen it needs. If you look at, for instance, vascular dementia, Alzheimer's, you can see that there's hypoperfusion or reduced blood supply to certain regions of the brain. And so if you can't get oxygen and nutrients into those individual cells, then they can't do their job. They become dysfunctional. And then over time, you start to see inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And those are the hallmarks of every chronic disease. And, fortunately, I think for us, nitric oxide corrects all 4 of those. It dilates the blood vessels, so it expands the blood vessels, so it improves oxygen delivery. It reduces inflammation. Several of my patents are on methods of reducing inflammation by nitric oxide. It inhibits the oxidative stress we see in dysfunctional cells and tissues, and it prevents the immune dysfunction. So this simple molecule restores everything we know about the onset and progression of chronic disease.
Good heavens. So where does it come from? I mean, you say it's naturally occurring. Are we do we manufacture it in our body, or where does it come from?
We do. So it's recognized there are two primary production pathways. So there's an enzyme. It's called nitric oxide synthase, and this enzyme is found in the lining of the blood vessels, our endothelial cells. In fact, it's found in every cell type in the human body. It's found in our red blood cells. So that enzyme converts an amino acid called L-arginine into nitric oxide. It's a very complex, complicated biochemical reaction. And then we also understand that it comes from the bacteria that live in and on our body. So for instance, the microbiome is extremely important now. The skin microbiome, oxidizes ammonia to nitric oxide on the surface of the skin. There are oral bacteria that live on the crypts of the tongue that are nitrate reducers, and they reduce nitrate to nitrite and nitric oxide gas. And then there's obviously bacteria in the gut that perform this metabolic function as well. So when we do things that disrupt the microbiome, all of it leads to a loss of nitric oxide production, and we start to get the symptoms that manifest as a result of that. Is sexual dysfunction, high blood pressure, metabolic disease, exercise intolerance, and vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, if not corrected.
So if we have microbiome that is responsible for producing this, whether it's on our skin, in our mouths, or in our gut, when we're living in a society where, heretofore antibiotics have been really overused, as we saw, is that playing a role in the drop of nitric oxide in some people?
No, absolutely. I mean, we know that destroying the microbiome in the gut, in the mouth, on the skin causes systemic disease. And as you know, the bacteria that live in and on our body outnumber our human cells 10-1. So we're actually more bacteria than we are human. And you destroy this ecology in the microbiome to your own demise. So, overusing antibiotics, obviously, if you've got an acute infection, we need antibiotics. Those have saved lives. But overprescribing antibiotics, especially during COVID to fight a viral infection and secondary bacterial infections, I think did more harm than good. And now we live in a germophobic society where, people want to use antibacterial hand soaps and lotions. And, 2 out of 3 Americans use antiseptic mouthwash every day. And there's fluoride in our toothpaste, which is an antiseptic, and fluoride in many municipalities in their water supply. So all of these things destroy the microbiome, and it's causing chronic disease. And so to me, it's no wonder and no mystery why Americans are some of the sickest people on the face of the planet.
So what about this? Let's go back to birth. Okay, there's been a drastic shift over the last 50 years away from nursing. Doesn't the infant get a lot of its microbiome by nursing with the mother?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's translocation and inoculation of bacteria from the infants during birth. And obviously, if you look at the microbiome of vaginally delivered babies versus cesarean delivered babies, the long-term outcome studies are worse. The cesarean delivered babies have more autoimmune disease. They have sicker later in life, and even metabolic disease, where vaginally delivered babies seem to be healthier. And then you put on top of that breastfed babies. The epidemiological data show that breastfed babies, really 6 months is all you need to show benefits that last 15, 20, 30 years. So breastfed babies have, lower incidence of diabetes, autoimmune disease, hypertension later in life. And so we get the inoculation of these bacteria through delivery, through vaginal delivery, and through breastfeeding. And we published, I believe it was in 2011, that a lot of the protective benefits of breastfeeding, the colostrum, before the milk is actually produced through the breast, is delivering nitrite as a primary source of nitric oxide to the baby. And we compared this to formulas, commercial formulas, and it's completely devoid of this. So there's known health disparities between formula-fed babies and breastfed babies, and people thought it was the loss of the immunological factors, the immunoglobulins from the breast milk, but we think that's just part of the story. I think it all goes back to the loss of that early nitric oxide that's being provided from the colostrum, 2-3 days after birth. And so it's extremely important to get that first colostrum.
Now, the colostrum, as I understand it, as a mother, is what the breasts produce before they produce milk. So it's the first thing the baby gets?
No, that's exactly right. So it starts, 1 day postpartum or at the day of delivery. And it's really a clear, somewhat of a milky substance. But really around day 4 or 5, you start to get what's called transition milk, and that's the transition from the colostrum to the mature milk. And then usually after about a week or 10 days, the breasts start producing what we call mature milk. So there's this evolution, and the quality of the colostrum from the transition milk to the mature milk completely changes. And that's by design, because these babies need that precious colostrum early in life, when they're first delivered. And I think it's because of the nitric oxide, and I think it's because of the, immunoglobulin transfer and the immune function and support that provides to the new baby.
So does receiving what it gets through the colostrum, does that actually prepare it for the next stages, being able to digest and utilize the next stages of the milk?
No, absolutely, because we start to see about day 3 and day 4, you start to see the bacterial colonization of the baby's gut. We're born sterile. We're in this environment, the internal environment of the uterus for 9 months, and then we're exposed to the outside world, and then we start become inoculated. So what we published in that seminal paper in 2011 was that once the baby's gut and mouth becomes inoculated with the right microbiome, then the baby can start utilizing what's produced in the mature milk, and that what is transitioned away from the colostrum. So nature is exquisite design, and I'm always fascinated by how the human body is actually much smarter than we are. And many times we just got to get out of the way.
Yeah, it's just not nice to try to fool Mother Nature, is it?
That's right.
So the body is supposed to produce nitric oxide. Why does it stop making it as we get older?
Well, we have a clear understanding of that. A lot of it is due to the Western lifestyle, the Western diet, a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet. It's lack of physical exercise. It's, lack of exposure to sunlight. There's certain wavelengths of light that can stimulate and release nitric oxide. And there's some genetic predisposition. So there's what we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, that we're born
Say what?
with. So these are, we call it SNPs. It's an acronym for a long scientific term. But what that means is you may be born with the blueprint of an enzyme or a protein that maybe you just have one copy of it, or one functional copy. Or in some people, it's what we call a homozygous, where they don't have a functional copy on either the mother or the father's donations from the DNA. So there are obviously some genetic predispositions, but most of it is simply, we lose the function of the enzyme over time because of lifestyle. And again, it's, we're overfed in America. I think everybody can agree to that. But, we eat too much simple carbohydrates and sugar. And, when we get an elevation in blood glucose, as the name implies, it's glue. It's a very sticky substance, right? And everybody's seen this. If you spill a soda water on the countertop and you come back the next day, it's sticky, right? Well, that's the sugar, that's the glucose that causes sticky. So when our sugar rises in our body, it sticks to proteins and sticks to enzymes. So then these proteins and enzymes can't do their job because they're kind of glued together in a conformational and unable to undergo a conformational change. So that's number one. We have to eliminate sugar and simple carbs from our diet.
Well, we're going to have to go to number 2 on the other side of the station break. Dr. Bryan and I will be back very shortly to continue this discussion, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. How can a colorless, odorless gas impact our health? With us this hour discussing the hidden role of nitric oxide in health and disease is Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, the author of The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing the Science to Life. Dr. Bryan, we were talking about the reason that we stopped making the nitric oxide, and you gave us one reason, and that has to do with our diet and lifestyle. And let's move on to number 2.
Yeah, number 2 is a lack of physical exercise. Exercise is medicine, because when we start to exercise, it stimulates and activates the production of nitric oxide, because we have to adapt to this low oxygen environment and dilate blood vessels and improve oxygen and nutrient delivery to working skeletal muscles and to the lungs to take up the oxygen. We don't exercise as much as we did 40 or 50 years ago, and I think it's showing. So those are the big two. It's diet and lifestyle. And then the other thing we've recently discovered, really over the past 15 or 20 years, is, antiseptics, antibiotics, antiseptic mouthwash, things that destroy the microbiome are completely shutting down nitric oxide production. We published years ago that 2 out of 3 Americans wake up every morning and use mouthwash, and 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. And this is now causative. That if you destroy the microbiome, you shut down nitric oxide production, and we see an increase in blood pressure.
Isn't that interesting? We've been looking at it from all the wrong angles, haven't we?
No, that's right. And this explains what we call resistant hypertension, because most people are aware if you have high blood pressure, you go to your doctor and he puts you on blood pressure medicine. And there are 3 or 4 main classes of blood pressure medicines that affect different root causes of hypertension. But yet 50% of the people that are put on prescription medication for blood pressure don't respond with better blood pressure. And this is resistant hypertension because it's resistant to standard therapy. Now, what we're finding, and we published on this in 2019, was that the reason for the high blood pressure is oral dysbiosis. So now we're finding that those people who have high blood pressure are the ones using antiseptic mouthwash, fluoride in their toothpaste, fluoride in their drinking water that's destroying the oral microbiome, shutting down nitric oxide production, and it's causing an increase in blood pressure. So now we can have a conversation for the first time in really the history of Western medicine of how do we wean people off of prescription medications to understand the mechanism of disease to the extent that you can address root cause. And now we tell people, well, stop using mouthwash, get rid of the fluoride in your toothpaste, buy a home filtration system to remove the fluoride. Let's give that 30 days, and remarkably, their blood pressure normalizes. And it's all because we're restoring the proper ecology of the oral microbiome.
So what's the mechanism of the blood pressure rising because we don't have nitric oxide? What's going on there?
Well, it's really a simple physics problem because, we have a finite volume of blood, right, that's pumped throughout the body. So without nitric oxide, the blood vessels become constricted, right? So now we've got that same volume of blood pumping through smaller pipes. And by physics, that means pressure is going to go up. So if we can dilate the blood vessels and restore the production of nitric oxide, now we've got that same volume of blood going through larger pipes, and blood pressure comes down. So we address it specifically from a physics standpoint. And really what we're finding is, it's not a renin-angiotensin issue. So what we call ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, the primary class of drugs for treating hypertension, aren't effective. Calcium channel blockers typically aren't effective. It's a physics problem, and we address the physics of hypertension.
Well, it's about time, right?
That's right. Look, hypertension is the number 1 risk factor for the number 1 killer of men and women worldwide. And if we can normalize blood pressure, and again, 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. And think about if we can normalize blood pressure in 67% of the U.S. population and reduce the progression of the number 1 killer, which is cardiovascular disease. I mean, that's a fundamental change in how we treat patients, and changing healthcare policy and changing how we treat patients.
It's huge. Just that is huge. So which comes first, the reduction of nitric oxide or the disease?
Well, it's clear, we discovered this probably 20 years ago. It's the functional loss of nitric oxide that's really recognized as the earliest event in the onset and progression of chronic disease. In fact, when you lose the production of nitric oxide, many times that precedes the structural changes we see in cardiovascular disease or heart disease by many years, sometimes as much as a decade. So if you have high blood pressure, if you have what's called carotid intermediate thickness, or you've got an occlusion of the blood vessels, then that tells us that you've been nitric oxide deficient for many, many years. And so we have to address the loss of nitric oxide, or else you're not going to change the direction and the rapid progression of disease. It's what's causal for cardiovascular disease.
Well, now nitric oxide being a gas, does it show up in a blood test? When you do your CBD, is that something that they're going to find and look for at this point?
No, unfortunately, it's not. We do it in the research lab. We can look at metabolites of nitric oxide production and different oxidative metabolites and get a picture of kind of what our nitric oxide levels are. But it's not part of your standard blood draw, your labs. If you go to your primary care doc or specialist, they're not going to be able to tell you what your nitric oxide levels are. There are things that are correlations to it, like, again, some of my patents are methods of reducing triglycerides. We know that nitric oxide affects triglycerides. We know it reduces C-reactive protein, these acute phase markers of inflammation. But really what we have to rely on are symptoms. And so we understand there's a hierarchy of symptoms that manifest as a result of loss of nitric oxide. So, and the first one that manifests is erectile dysfunction. Because let's think about it, it's all about blood flow, right? If we can't dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs because those blood vessels can't make nitric oxide, then we don't get engorgement and we develop erectile dysfunction. And that occurs in both men and women. And so that's really, it's a sign of a systemic disease, because if you have endothelial dysfunction in the vascular bed of the sex organs, then you've got that same dysfunction in the heart, the brain, the liver. It's a systemic issue. And then what happens is you start to get an increase in blood pressure, because again, the simple physics of hypertension. And then if not corrected, you develop metabolic disease. Nitric oxide is absolutely required and essential for insulin signaling and glucose uptake. And we know in America, 9 out of 10 Americans are metabolically unfit. It's a huge problem. And then you start to get exercise intolerance, and if not corrected, you start to develop dementia and Alzheimer's. So that's the hierarchy of things. So if you have, erectile dysfunction, and 50% of the men over the age of 40 self-report ED, I think it's much higher numbers, because most men aren't going to self-report erectile dysfunction in their 40s. So it's worse. We have kids now that are showing up with erectile dysfunction, 18, 20 years old. And this is a huge, huge problem, because it's clearly a lack of nitric oxide production.
So our diet, like you mentioned, our diets are really high in sugar. They're also high in gluten. They're also high in GMOs, in chemicals. Are any of those playing a part here?
All of the above. The GMOs not so, but you got to understand, why does the food industry make genetically modified organisms, right? It's not the GMO that's the issue. It's the chemicals they spray on the GMO crops. And so glyphosate, Roundup, clear evidence of bloodborne cancers, leukemia, lymphoma, because what this does, it kills the bacteria in the soil. So now we can't assimilate nutrients in the food. And then glyphosate itself is a mitochondrial toxicant. It completely shuts down nitric oxide production, and it kills the microbiome in the human body. So this is the worst thing we can do, is spray our food and soil with a toxic chemical that kills the bacteria in the soil and kills the bacteria in our body. And then the other major problem is the rampant use of antacids. Antacids, we need antacids to break down proteins into amino acids. So humans are never designed to assimilate plant protein or animal protein into a human protein, right? Proteins are made of amino acids. We break down animal proteins or plant proteins into the constituent amino acids. And then the human cell takes those amino acids and manufactures human proteins from those. And without stomach acid, we don't get digestion of protein. We don't absorb nutrients, and it creates autoimmune disease. And it's a huge problem. And, in the US, if you're admitted to the hospital, it doesn't matter if it's for influenza-like illness, a heart attack, stroke, car accident, any trauma, no matter what your admission is, they put you on a proton pump inhibitor, an omeprazole or pantoprazole. And these are over-the-counter drugs like Prilosec and Prevacid. So when you go into the hospital, they inhibit stomach acid production. So now you can't absorb nutrients. You become acidotic. And it's the worst thing you can do to allow the body to heal itself, is to intentionally suppress stomach acid production.
So why on earth do they do that?
It's a good question. I ask that when I have family members admitted to the hospital and ask them why they do it. I go, well, to prevent heartburn in the hospital, lying down in a bed. And obviously, if you look at what they're feeding the patients in the hospital, it's no wonder that the worst thing we can do as Americans is be admitted to the hospital, because we don't get better. We get sicker, and many people die in the hospital, and it's unacceptable, because as a biochemist and physiologist, I take great pride in knowing how the human body works, and we've got to just support it and get out of the way. But, the people who had been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years, and these data came out 10 years ago, have a 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's, because they're completely shutting down nitric oxide production. And when you do that and you're at risk and you have risk factors for heart attack and stroke, the plaque becomes unstable, the plaque ruptures, and it's causing heart attack and stroke. And then you can't make stomach acid. You can't absorb things like magnesium, iron, B vitamins, iodine, things that the cell needs to do its job. So chronic disease is caused from nutrient deficiencies and exposure to toxins. And we as Americans are better than anybody at that by causing nutrient deficiencies and by exposure to toxins.
It's pretty scary, and it seems like we've modernized ourselves right into a corner, haven't we?
Look, I said the tide is turning. I mean, Americans are waking up and figuring out that the way we've been treating patients and the medicine we've been prescribed for the past 100 years isn't working. Medicine does not make anybody better. We have to get back to the root cause and figure out, get back to personalized medicine and what are you as an individual deficient in? And what are you as an individual exposed to that may be disrupting normal cellular metabolism? And if we can replete missing nutrients and remove from the body toxic chemicals or exposure to toxicants, then the human body heals itself. We're regenerative by nature. And drugs are simply, synthetic chemicals that inhibit biochemical reactions and treat symptoms, but we're never deficient in a synthetic compound. In fact, many of these are toxicants, right, that are leading to the exposure of toxins that are contributing to chronic disease. So we have to get away from that model.
I've heard a wonderful metaphor for it is like you have a fire alarm and there's a fire going, so you unplug the fire alarm. That's kind of the same thing we're doing in medicine at this point, isn't it?
No, that's right. Look, and I spent 20 years in academia, understanding, research and teaching future physicians, and it's, the model is wrong. We have to get back to understanding basic biochemistry and physiology. But yeah, what we do in medicine is look for symptoms, and then, the body always responds. And symptoms are a response to something that's going on in the body. The best example, which is a horrible example, is treating fever. If we get an infection, our body heats up core temperature to kill the infection, to increase catalytic activity of enzymes. And what do physicians want to do? They want to give you a fever reducer. They want to give you with acetaminophen, which is probably the top drug that kills more people from liver failure every year than any drug in the world, and suppress fever. The worst thing we can do to fight an infection is to suppress fever. And same thing, a cough. We don't need to suppress cough. Cough is a natural response to clear something from the airway. And suppressing cough, we eliminate the body's response to whatever it is we're trying to get rid of.
Well, it's time for us to take a station break. Dr. Bryan and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Does Western medicine really have it all wrong? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the many roles of nitric oxide is Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. His website, drnathansbryan.com. Dr. Bryan, we've been looking at, I've heard from so many sources that our medical system is broken. And myself, that's going to be the last place I go because I've never gotten help there for all the reasons that we've mentioned. How do you see turning this around? How can we repair our Western medical system with the knowledge that you're carrying there?
Well, I think we have to start at the top. It starts with policymakers and realizing that the way we've been doing things for the past 100 years is not working. It's clearly not working. All you have to do is look at the data, look at the numbers. The U.S. accounts for, a very small percentage of the global population, but yet we're prescribed 60% of the world's medication. And so, again, that shows us that prescription medication is not the answer to a healthier society, because we rank last in healthcare and the health of a nation in all industrialized nations. So, and it's a huge burden on the economy. It's a multi-trillion-dollar annualized addressable market. And it's a great financial model for big pharma, but it's a horrible model for the health of our citizens. And so I think we have to get back to understanding the mechanism of disease to the extent that you can address root cause. And it's very simple. We become a little bit too sophisticated in medicine because medicine is siloed, right? If you get a heart problem, you go to a cardiologist. If you got a neurological problem, you go to a neurologist or a psychologist. If you've got a GI problem, you go to a gastroenterologist. But you got to understand that the heart's connected to the GI tract's connected to the brain. So we may be treating the exact same underlying condition because it manifests differently in different people. What may manifest as a GI disorder in one patient may manifest as a ischemic heart disease or cardiomyopathy in another, or vascular dementia or psychosis or something in another patient. But again, it goes back to the basics.
So is it like whatever the weak link of the chain is? So we might be genetically predisposed to a weakness in one area or the other. And so when the nitric oxide drops, that's where it shows up?
No, that's exactly right. And it depends on the individuality of, what's in this person's diet. What is their genetic footprint? Are they exposed to, have they been used antibiotics? Have they used antiseptic mouthwash? Are they exposed to fluoride on a daily basis? All of these things, there are many things that contribute to the onset and progression of chronic disease. But from a mechanism of action standpoint, we know it's always, look at the 4 hallmarks: loss of blood supply to that organ, inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And, it can be traced back to nutrient deficiencies, exposure to toxins like we discussed earlier. But at the end of the day, it's a breakdown in the production of nitric oxide, which can explain the hallmarks of all those diseases. So if we can, and look, we know how to make nitric oxide, and that's what we focused on for the past 25 years. And it really corrects a lot of the fundamentals and the symptoms in restoring normal physiology. But look, if you're deficient in, magnesium or iodine or iron or hormones, the nitric oxide isn't going to, you still have to address that. If you're exposed to glyphosate or heavy metals or arsenic or things in our food, nitric oxide isn't going to rid that. I mean, indirectly it may, because we're improving circulation and increasing our detoxification pathways. But you still have to address the underlying problem. That's why micronutrient analysis is extremely important to know, what are you missing, and supplement what's missing in your body. And then do toxin analysis and look at exposure to heavy metals or viruses that may be latent, or other chemicals, organic chemicals, and then remove yourself from the source of exposure and detoxify your body. Nitric oxide is foundational for all that, but again, you have to address the patient as the N=1 that's sitting in front of you.
So this sounds like pretty advanced testing and everything that probably isn't available for the average person at this point. Is that correct?
Now, these are standard tests. You just got to ask. If you go to your primary care doctor specialist, they're probably not going to order these labs. You have to ask. You have to demand it. But these labs are reimbursable. They have ICD-10 codes. And if you've been dealing with a chronic disease that's been poorly managed by conventional allopathic physicians, then fire your doctor. If your car keeps breaking down, you take it to the same mechanic and he doesn't fix it. It's very simple. You fire the mechanic. And I think we have to have that same philosophy with doctors. If you're sick and you've been sick for years and you've been going to the same doctor, he's not doing his job, and you have to fire them. And you have to look at somebody who looks a little bit deeper into the mechanism of disease to address you as a patient, individual patient.
Well, it seems like we'd have to fire a whole system because, we've gotten to the point that while the doctors are trying to cure people, the insurance companies are taking control of healthcare. And so this whole structure is built. Well, this is your preferred provider. Okay. And then that poor preferred provider spends more time looking for diagnostic codes on a computer than they do looking at the individual. And there's these real basic things they look for. And then they just start recycling you through it. Okay.
No, that's exactly right. But you have to show them the numbers, right? And so if you look at the cost of treating chronic disease over time versus taking a preventative approach and being proactive, the cost of healthcare drop precipitously. And so we're working with some people now, some actuaries, and really hoping to put in place insurance policies and plan that pay for preventative measures. And I think once the actuaries do this and the payers realize that it's going to save them money, they're going to become more profitable. And then you have to change what's called the standard of care. And then and only then can this be kind of can be implemented from the top and down into individual physicians and patient care. But it's a process. You can't, naively we thought we could do this years ago, but you can't do this without some political capital and understanding the policymakers and getting them to open their eyes, because healthcare, as long as I've been alive, through every administration that I can remember dating back to the 70s, healthcare has been a #1 priority for every new administration that's come into power, and nobody's done anything about it. And it's only gotten worse.
That's pretty discouraging, isn't it?
No, it
So,
is.
so it looks like we're going to have to, follow the money, basically. So you have to make it look to the powers that be, aka the insurance companies, how it's going to benefit them monetarily before it gets to the patient.
No, you're exactly right. You have to follow the money, because the epiphany for me came because I was struggling when I was a professor of molecular medicine, because I think we do a really good job of treating the basic science, or of teaching the basic sciences, and physiology and pathology and biochemistry. But then where did we go wrong? And the problem is, when I had this epiphany that you have to look at medicine as a business, right? It's a multi-trillion-dollar. It's the largest business model in the world. And so, as an entrepreneur and business owner myself, as a for-profit company, our goal is to acquire as many customers as we can and keep those customers for as long as we can. And that's what medicine does. That's what big pharma does. That's what, the medical system does. We get a patient on a drug. We keep them because there's never a conversation of getting you off that drug. The conversation is, if this drug isn't working or isn't effective, come back and I'll give you another drug. Now you're 50, 60 years old and people are on 12, 15, 18 different medications.
And we don't know how they interact with each other. I mean, those studies haven't been done, have they?
Those studies have never been done. When you do clinical studies, drug studies, you put that drug in a patient, a naive patient, and look at the effects of that drug. But there's never a study looking at how does this drug interact with the half dozen other drugs that patient may be on, treated for many different other comorbidities or symptoms or diseases. So prescription drugs are the 3rd leading cause of death in America.
Oh, my goodness.
These are FDA-approved drugs that are approved because they've demonstrated safety and efficacy in a specific indication. But you throw those on top of a half a dozen or dozen other drugs, they're no longer safe. And we're over-medicated. Polypharmacy is not the answer. It's a great economic model because these companies are making billions and billions of dollars a year, but they're not making anybody better. And so we have to change that. And again, I think it goes back to understanding the mechanism of disease, starting at the top, follow the money, expose these people that are intentionally doing things and giving patients, drugs, which there's no safety data on, and they're not making anybody better because they're not addressing the root cause of that person's disease.
It sounds like a large job, but somebody's got to do it, right?
Well, no, it's a very tall task, and it's a very dangerous task too, because when you start to impede upon the market share of companies that have multi-billion-dollar drugs, and you start for the first time weaning people off of these drugs and getting into the profit and the bottom line of these companies, you're impeding on a multi-billion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar financial system. So it's a huge task, and I don't take this lightly. And I can't do it alone. We have to have a force, and I think the timing is now. I see it. I feel the beachhead coming, and it's we have to do differently. We have to do better, and we can do better.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it, but you might want to get a bodyguard, right?
That's right. We become a target for sure.
For sure. So we've been talking about a gas, okay? Now, if I'm taking calcium, it's a powder, okay? How on
Yeah.
earth do you supplement out of a gas? You run around like,
Well, that's been the challenge in medicine, because the only approved indication for nitric oxide therapy is inhalative nitric oxide therapy that's used in the neonatal intensive care unit. And this is for premature babies born with pulmonary hypertension. So you actually deliver the gas through a nasal cannula. So the challenge for me and my research group years ago was, how do we develop a solid dose form of nitric oxide gas? And that's been my claim to fame, is I have a solid dose form of nitric oxide gas that when you put it in your mouth, it slowly dissolves over 5 to 6 minutes. And as it's dissolving, it's liberating 20 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas, the same therapeutic amount that you would get in a critical care, intensive care unit for pulmonary hypertension. So this is, I'm sorry.
What kind of shelf life do the supplements have?
We have stability data out to 3 years when you manufacture it and put it in a bottle with a desiccant and keep it in a cool, dry place. But no, it's remarkable, and we're seeing this have remarkable effects on a number of conditions. We have what's called dietary supplements and nutritional products on the market. We're working through the FDA to get drug therapy approved. For our ischemic heart disease drug is working its way through it. We've got a drug for Alzheimer's that I think nitric oxide is the cure that will completely eradicate Alzheimer's disease. And then we make a topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. And, there's really no indication where nitric oxide would not be beneficial when given at the right dose at the right time to the right patient. So that's what we're working on.
Well, that sounds like a tall order as well. You must be a busy man.
Look, it's a very daunting task, but I see the effects that it has on people. I wake up every morning to get dozens, if not hundreds, of emails, text, phone calls of people that indicated we changed their life. From people who have had poorly managed high blood pressure for 30 years and been on prescription medication for 30 or 40 years, and we address these fundamentals and restore nitric oxide production. Their blood pressure is normal, their sexual function returns, their brain function improves. And it's, people call me in tears saying that we've saved their life, we've changed their life, and we've published on this before in the past in the published literature. So, that's what keeps me going. I think we all have to wake up every morning with a purpose, and there's no greater purpose to me than to change the way that medicine's practiced today and address root cause where we can completely eradicate chronic disease.
That would be a beautiful thing. Absolutely would be. And there's no reason it can't happen. I mean, we're so advanced on so many other avenues that it's time that we started focusing here. Well, it is time for us to take another station break. Please stay with us as Dr. Bryan and I continue our discussion. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. So where do I get nitric oxide? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. His website, drnathansbryan.com. So taking supplementation is kind of a stopgap, isn't it? Are you finding that educating people on how to eliminate the things that are destroying the nitric oxide production, do you think ultimately that'll be more effective?
I think so. That's always our first kind of priority, is to understand what people are doing, what's leading to a loss of nitric oxide production. Because this is a gas that's naturally produced. Although we and others have published that the older we get, the less we make, we can overcome that. We can prevent this age-related loss of nitric oxide production by employing these very simple strategies. And it goes back to stop doing the things that are disrupting it and start doing the things that promote it. So again, we just tell people, stop eating sugar, stop eating simple carbohydrates. Continuous glucose monitors are available everywhere. Understand what leads to elevation in blood sugar for you, and then stop doing that. Get rid of mouthwash, get rid of fluoride in your toothpaste, get a home filtration system to remove fluoride from your water if you're one of the 73% of the municipalities that put fluoride in their water. And then if you're using antacids, you have to stop using antacids. Now, if you do those things, you've released the brakes on natural nitric oxide production, and then you can just, 20, 30 minutes of moderate physical exercise a day, throw in some more green leafy vegetables, again, a balanced diet in moderation, good protein, healthy fats, green leafy vegetables, and then, 20, 30 minutes of sunlight a day. And that's typically sufficient. But what we're finding is, because we live in a toxic world, the foods that we eat aren't nutrient rich, and so we almost have to supplement. And that's where our product technology comes in. Your body can't make nitric oxide, then we do it for you through this orally disintegrating tablet. We make a fermented beet powder for energy and pre-workout, and then I've made a topical line of products for skincare and beauty that we're developing for topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. So everything we do is focused on the production of nitric oxide.
If we look at what's been going on in our society for the last 50, 75 years, and particularly once it became, Dr. Spock came on the scene, the man should have been shot, and said, oh, you don't want a nurse, that's dirty. Here, have this nice sterile bottle with this nice sterile, sterile being the operative word, right? Sterile formula in it. Do you think that we have actually come to a deficit that the mother has a deficit, the child has a deficit, and it keeps passing down? Do you think we have more of a deficit from the get-go than we did, say, 50 years ago?
No doubt. I mean, again, this isn't my opinion. This is supported by real data. If you look at the nutrients in the soil from the 1940s to the 2010s, there's a 76% reduction in basic micronutrients in the soil in America. So the food that we're eating, we're not getting enough the basic requirements for basic nutrients and vitamins and minerals in the food we eat. So now if you go back and you eradicate the microbiome, 100 years ago, we didn't know about the microbiome, right? So every bacteria were foreign pathogens. So we did everything we could to kill bacteria, good, bad, or indifferent. Today, we don't do that because we know better. And so anything that's killing the microbiome is causing systemic disease. So if you go back to this evolution, this very downward slide in health of Americans, it goes back to, again, we're nutrient deplete. So nursing mothers are transferring less basic nutrients into the breast milk. We're exposed to much more tens of thousands of chemicals that we weren't, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so it goes back to this epidemic of nutrient deficiency, overexposure of toxins, and it's causing human disease. And prescription medications will not fix that. And it's apparent. You have to understand individualized, personalized medicine. What are you deficient in? What is your toxic burden? Replete nutrients, remove the toxins, and the body heals itself. It's really, really that simple. It's cost effective, and it's the only way we're going to get healthier.
So a person's been listening to this and they go, I want some of that, right?
Yeah.
So we know you go on your website, you can find where you can get the supplements that you've created, but where does the person go to get the knowledge? I mean, is there some place where they can go to have somebody look at them and say, well, individualized medicine, this is what your individual
Sure.
system looks like, where the deficiencies are coming from? Is there some place that a person can find that?
We've created resources, and my goal is not to sell you products. My goal is to educate and inform you to where you can make educated, informed decisions on what's best for you. So the drnathансbryan.com is an educational website. There's no products for sale on there. I've got a YouTube channel where we provide a lot of interviews, content. It's Dr. Nathan S Bryan, nitric oxide, on YouTube. My latest project, and you referenced this, but this book, The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing the Science to Life, is my latest, and it tells the whole story of nitric oxide. I've published over 100 peer-reviewed papers in the scientific literature, but what I found is most people don't read the scientific literature. So what I tried to do was tell this story in this book, The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing the Science to Life, so that people can understand the complex science in a way that's easily readable and digestible.
So there aren't clinics out yet or anything where a person can go to kind of get a tune-up or a closer look. You have to pretty much go out there and research yourself in the sources that you've said.
There are some really good integrative and functional medicine docs that are showing up. Okay. It's a cash practice, because insurance doesn't cover anything that actually makes patients better. But you have to look for them, and many communities are stepping up, and we're kind of doing our own work and creating wellness centers over the next couple of years all around the world that address the fundamentals of chronic disease.
Very nice. So is there any instance where nitric oxide supplementation is counterindicated or is harmful?
Look, dose dictates toxicity. So yeah, you can overdo it. Water is absolutely essential, but if we drink too much water over a short period of time, it can kill us. But yeah, what we worry about in nitric oxide are only two things. Number one, it's an unsafe drop in blood pressure. If you take too much, it can lead to systemic vasodilation, you lose perfusion pressure, and you can develop end organ damage or syncope and pass out. The other condition, which we rarely see, is called methemoglobinemia. And that's where you take too much nitric oxide, it oxidizes the iron of hemoglobin and reduces the oxygen carrying capacity of the red cells. So you become cyanotic, and you usually see this blueness around the lips, blue on the extremities. So it's a hypoxic condition. But we've never seen it with any of the products that we've developed. We've monitored, even pediatric patients in the intensive care unit dosing with our nitric oxide lozenge, and there's never been an appearance of any elevation in methemoglobin. And
so when do you see it? When they're administering the gas?
Yeah, so the safety studies on inhalative nitric oxide therapy were done, 40 years ago in the 1980s and 90s. So that's how they developed the safe administration of nitric oxide gas, looking at methemoglobin formation in the most vulnerable population on Earth. And these are, neonates that are born, 25, 32 weeks. I mean, very risky, susceptible patients. And yet inhalative nitric oxide therapy has saved the lives of millions of babies. So we know it's extremely safe when administered as indicated. And that's what we've spent, I've spent 20, 25 years understanding how much nitric oxide does the normal healthy human being make. And then I want to deliver that back to them. So it's basically supplement, right? So if you're low in vitamin D, if you've got a vitamin D of 30, then we know we got to treat you to a dose that's sufficient to get your vitamin D to 80. Nitric oxide, I mean, we don't have the convenience of treating a number for nitric oxide because we can't measure. But what we do is we treat based on individuals and using the best medical judgment of the healthcare practitioner of what's best and what's the best dosing regimen for that individual patient. And we see people get better all the time.
So, but it's based on symptoms rather than tests. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are tests out there. There's functional devices. There's a device called the CV Profiler that I use. There's a device called the EndoPAT, which uses venous occlusion plethysmography and looks at functional nitric oxide response and how well the blood vessels are producing nitric oxide. So there are FDA-cleared medical devices out there. Not a lot of people use them. I hope they start to integrate them more in primary care because they're extremely important and can predict, the onset and progression of cardiovascular disease. But yeah, we have to rely on symptoms for the most part.
Okay. So outside of supplements, how can we build nitric oxide back up when we've become deficient? What's the best way to do that?
Well, I think it's very simple. You just, again, change your diet, less carbs, more green leafy vegetables, no mouthwash, no fluoride, no antacids, 20, 30 minutes of exercise a day, 20, 30 minutes of sunlight, and focusing on restoring the microbiome, the oral microbiome, the gut microbiome. These bacteria that live in and on our body are there to do essential metabolic functions that we as humans are either inefficient at doing or aren't able to do. So we rely on these bacteria. It's called a symbiotic relationship. The bacteria benefit from us and we benefit from the bacteria.
Well, it seems like the deficiency in them is rampant at this point. But how do you build those back up? I know people take probiotics and prebiotics and all this stuff and still with marginal success. Is that because they're tearing it down on one side while they're trying to build it on the other? Or is it just not a really good way to do it?
It's a numbers game. I mean, we got trillions of bacteria that live in and on our body, and we're giving, the best probiotics, maybe, 10 or 20 billion spores of a probiotic. So it's 0.1% or less of what we're trying to re-inoculate with. And the other thing is, the oral microbiome is completely different than the gut microbiome, which is completely different than the vaginal microbiome. It's completely different than the skin microbiome. So you have to address the ecology of these different microbiomes differently. So we know we focus specifically on the oral microbiome. And in fact, we're launching a nitric oxide friendly toothpaste and mouth rinse, just next week. So because what we believe, again, I think we know this. So there's 3 levels of conviction. You think, you believe, and you know. I'm at the level of conviction where I know because I've seen it. But if we can target the microbiome and eliminate the fluoride and start putting things in our toothpaste and mouth rinse that support the oral microbiome, we can normalize blood pressure. Now think about that. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. And if we can get them to use our nitric oxide friendly toothpaste and mouth rinse, we can normalize their blood pressure in many of these patients. And that's never happened before. And that will change the landscape of what we're doing. So yeah, we understand that. Most of the probiotics and prebiotics on the market actually have very little clinical benefit. Fecal transplants for C. diff, for example, that shows you the power of the right microbiome and the right environment. Clinically, a very powerful clinical tool for treating Clostridium difficile, which is very difficult to treat. You just do a fecal transplant. You put the right microbiome in the gut, and it, destroys the pathogens.
Well, it has been wonderful speaking with you again and all the information you're bringing. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
So thank you, Gwilda, for having me. It's I always appreciate a platform where we can educate and inform people, and hopefully if it touches one person's life, then we've done our job.
Well, I'm sure it'll touch a lot of people's lives. And again, thank you for what you're doing. Our guest this hour has been Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. Dr. Bryan is an international leader in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry and the author of The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing the Science to Life. To find out more about Dr. Bryan and all he has to offer, visit his website, drnathansbryan.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join me right here next time. This mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.